Hello, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good whatever it is, wherever you may be. Um, this video is going to be a response or feedback to another video that was done on Monday. It's now Thursday morning. This video that I'm responding to was done on Monday evening. It was from a channel here on YouTube called Late Night Echo Chamber. It was episode 2, their second live stream, and it was called episode 2, Trump Care Identity Politics, Emmanuel Macron Defeats Marine Le Pen. I'm making a video response because YouTube has a character limit on comments, which I never knew before because I have never hit it before. So I had to break up my feedback into 3 separate comments, and all of which apparently hit YouTube's spam filter, yay. I'm going to apologize in advance for my voice because I've been having allergies, and I am also a smoker, so I've been smoking all night, and it's morning now. So I'm going to have to pause several times probably to take a sip of soda and try to get frog out of my throat and so forth. So I apologize in advance for that. Smoking is bad for your voice, kids, so if you haven't started, don't. Okay, and I'm talking about tobacco here. If you want to smoke the green and it's legal where you are, hey, none of my business. And I'm not going to tell you not to. Anyway, so like I said, this is a belated feedback, basically. I missed the live stream on Monday evening for a variety of reasons, and I would probably have ordinarily gone to sit in and might have offered my feedback in the text chat live at the time if I had managed to get in there, but I didn't. So so here's this. Goodness. I'm going to limit myself in this video to the first topic that they covered. And I'll return later and watch the rest of their video. And when I do that, I may have some feedback about other topics they covered. But for this video, I'm just going to be discussing their first topic, which was identity politics. Before I get into that, however, I'd like to offer a prefatory observation or note or whatever. There's a lot of use of left and right in the video that that I'm responding to, or to which I am responding. I'm going to include some links in the video description to some of my work where I discuss a variety of dimensions of perspective, because this one-dimensional single-line continuum that we're all familiar with, or I hope most of us at least are familiar with, that puts left on one end and right on the other end and center in the middle, and then associates terms like liberal and progressive with left, and conservative and ultra-conservative with right, and moderate with center. That's very limited and very limiting, and it's really, really quite incomplete. Liberal doesn't mean left, and conservative doesn't mean right. I'm sorry, they're totally different axes of perspective. We're talking about different dimensions here. Left, center, and right. The way we usually use these terms in ordinary speech, we're talking about economics. We're not talking about social concerns and issues and cultural attitudes. And the terms of radical, progressive, liberal, moderate, conservative, ultra-conservative, reactionary, those are terms which do apply to social issues and concerns and cultural attitudes. And social and cultural are two different axes as well, but they're somewhat closely related because there is some overlapping between them, and therefore the way that we talk about them tends to use the same terms. It would, of course, be better if we could use different terms for all of these different axes or dimensions of perspective, but I mean, there are only so many words in a language, and of course, a language is a living thing and it grows and adds to its vocabulary. But anyway, left, center, and right refer to economics. They should not be conflated with social and cultural terms like radical, progressive, liberal, moderate, conservative, ultra-conservative, and reactionary. Okay, so that's my little preface. I'll come back to that probably a few times as I discuss my feedback here. And I'm going to pause for just a moment to take a sip of my soda. And then, without any further ado, I will delve into the first topic of their discussion. And the first topic was, as I think I've already said, identity politics. So excuse me for a moment while I take this sip. And try to figure out what my cat is into. What are you doing? All right. Okay, so now let's jump right in here. Identity politics is primarily concerned with social matters and secondarily with economic matters. As I mentioned above, there is some confusion between social and cultural. They do overlap to some extent, and to some extent they are concerned with some of the same matters, but there are distinctions between the two. And so I'm going to say that social matters are the primary concern of identity politics. Secondarily, identity politics is concerned with economic matters, and cultural matters come in third at best, at least in terms of the situation in the United States. When we start expanding to other societies outside the United States, then yes, cultural matters become more relevant, or at least they should become more relevant, although they don't always. Okay, so in the video to which I'm responding, Riley offered definition of identity politics, and I'm not going to criticize that definition. I am going to, however, point out that theoretical academic conceptions may not always be applied appropriately in practice. It is the case that the way in which identity politics has been increasingly being done, regardless of the theoretical academic definition, the way in which identity politics has been increasingly done by what are best called limousine liberals has been a loss of the plot to the point that they have used it more and more to divide people into separate categories rather than to promote a solidarity. You pointed out yourself that it is individual to at least some extent in relation to social institutions, and that's part of the issue. When identity is focused on to the point of tunnel vision, as it has been among the limousine liberals, The result is exactly the opposite of solidarity, because the result is division. And a conspiratorially minded person might be forgiven for believing that this was the plan all along, going back to the old scheme of divide ut regnes, or as it's more commonly given, divide ut impera, because that is the outcome, division, whether it were intended or not. And of course, divide ut regnes is Latin for divide in order that you may rule, and divide et impera is Latin for divide and conquer. Kevin used the term exclusionary in relation to identity politics, and he's right in terms of practice, regardless of what theory says. You also touched upon intersectional feminism when you were talking about defining identity politics. Now, I understand intersectional feminism in theory, but in practice, most of the people who talk about intersectionality and get public attention while doing so seem to be engaging in what is essentially newspeak, much like opponents of net neutrality recently have been talking about how they want to promote, quote, free and open internet, end quote, or proponents of the Republican health care bill have claimed that it will increase choices for patients and healthcare professionals, when both claims could not be further from the truth. And when I talk about public attention in reference to people using the term intersectionality, I intend mostly media coverage, although new media of social networks, including YouTube, figures in, as well as more traditional media outlets. So public attention, meaning media coverage, but also meaning the audience that you get, whether it's from traditional media outlets or new media like social networks, including YouTube, videos, and so forth, live stream. But perhaps this difference in the meaning of intersectional feminism, depending on context, is another case of theoria versus praxis, or strategy versus tactics, or academia versus actuality. Also, disabled is an identity, at least in some perceptions of identity politics. I think I understand what porcelain means. Disability is frequently regarded as a category of identity, in the sense that, for example, public policy is crafted for the disabled as if they were a category of identity. People with a disability are often related to as other and treated differently or awkwardly. The disabled are addressed in public policy as if one size fits all, when of course disability is not a single thing, but an umbrella term for many conditions and situations which differ from one another. Kevin, and I feel really weird calling you that because I know you by your internet handle, but it just takes some getting used to. So Kevin, the slurring of opponents and even sympathetic critics as racist, sexist, homophobic, and so forth, etc., goes back to at least the early years of this century, and political correctness after it became popular, when newcomers to the idea started defining it in terms which insisted that any criticism of the ideas of political correctness was necessarily some form of bigotry. It was wrong then, and it's wrong now. Um, and by analogy, so was Anselm's attempt to define the Abrahamic God into existence. What happened was, when political correctness became a sort of a popular fad, these people who came into the idea of the ideals of political correctness, who didn't really understand what it was about, who wanted to get involved and start making a difference and so on, well, they started making public statements, and involved in those public statements were their definitions of, what is political correctness, and these definitions actually wound up in most cases turning into brief essays, in which, and I am not kidding you, they actually basically came out and said, if you criticize this, then you're a racist and a sexist and a homophobe. Which was, mind-boggling, to say the least. But there you go. It was wrong, as I've said, to do that. And it's wrong now in terms of the way identity politics has been being done, to define anyone who disagrees or even dares to offer constructive criticism as all these things which should have more meaning than just being used to refer to anyone who disagrees with you or anyone who dares question you or even offer constructive criticism. But some people still haven't learned that, even with the recent election results being partially due to such puerile reactions to opponents and or critics. Riley, hierarchy is natural. Now, before you freak out, I'm not talking about hierarchy based on race or sex or gender or economic status. Hierarchy doesn't have to be and should not be based on race or sex or gender or economic status or sexuality or any of those things. But there is not now, and there never was, and there never will be a classless society. Even as early as the Proto-Indo-European times, according to Dumézil, society was divided into 3 castes. And when I say castes, I'm not talking about, and Dumézil was not talking about, the caste system as it has been expressed in modern India, where you're born into a caste and you have no hope of ever leaving that caste. A caste system in the original Proto-Indo-European conception was a division of society into priesthood, warriors, and producers, basically. Plato talks about the same kind of thing whenever he talks about his republic with the philosopher kings, the guardians, and the artisans. In Celtic culture in the Iron Age and early medieval period, as codified into Brehon law, or early Irish law, if you will, the Sin Chasmór, you have these 3 classes, where you had the Istana, the people of the gift, the Boeri, which were the farmers, ranchers, cattle lords, if you will, and you had the warrior caste, the people who trained to be the defenders of the tribe. And the same 3 appear over and over in various different Proto-Indo-European cultures and cultures which came in contact with them. But what I'm talking about in terms of hierarchy isn't really so much in terms of a division of function, like into the priestly, warrior or guardian, and artisan or producer, craftsman, farmer, rancher. That's just a division of labor, and those are three classes which are social classes, but not necessarily economic classes. What I'm talking about is a natural hierarchy, which may be somewhat similar to what Jefferson meant when he talked about a natural aristocracy. And I don't agree entirely with Jefferson's perspective on that, but when I'm talking about a natural hierarchy, I'm talking about people who have more experience and more training in a given field or a given craft or whatever. They're naturally going to be in charge of the less experienced and the less trained. Now, that doesn't always happen in our present society because people know people and they get put in positions that they shouldn't be in. You know, this is not a meritocratic society, unfortunately. But in a natural society, a society which is ordered not based on who you know or how much money you have or whether you have a penis or what color your skin is or any of these things. Yeah, the people who know what they're doing are naturally going to be in charge of the people who are young and inexperienced and untrained, apprentices and so forth. You would not, for example, even in this society here today, take a person with an associate's degree and make them the chair of the Department of Philosophy and place them in an administrative position over a person with a PhD in that discipline. Okay, so yes, hierarchy is a thing. Hierarchy is natural, and hierarchy is necessary, but it doesn't have to be and should not be based on nonsensical distinctions, or who you knew or who you slept with, or how much money you have, or any of that sort of thing. And I don't think that there's anything right wing about that. I mean, that just kind of boggles my mind to hear to hear that said. But I am presuming that you were referring to the unnatural hierarchy, uh, um, which is based on who you know and how much money you have and what your sex is and so forth. But there's nothing right wing about a natural hierarchy, unless by right wing you mean anything to the right of Marxism. Now, also, I'm still responding to Riley here. You are quite right that socialism and state capitalism are not the same thing. Socialism is not state ownership of the means of production. The basic concept of socialism is the means of production in the hands of the producers, the workers owning and controlling the means of production. And no, electing someone to public office to represent you does not make state control of anything socialistic. In fact, these days, unfortunately, it seems like the people we elect to represent us don't. And I think we are all too well aware of that. They typically represent the lobbyists who fill their pockets, or they represent the party line, or whatever particular ideological perspective the group of people in their party with whom they caucus stand for. In fact, I've noticed more and more over the past several years that members of the United States House of Representatives don't call themselves representatives such and such anymore. They have on their letterheads, instead of representative so and so, they have so and so, member of Congress. And I think that's kind of telling, really, in that they may not really see themselves as as representing us, you know. Um, but certainly there are, I guess you could call them socialist aspects of public works like the highway department and so on. But not socialist in the technical sense, and I don't mean simply Marxist sense, because there are, you know, I mean, Marxism is only one type of socialism, and there are many other types of socialism. And to be precise, Marxism is communist or collectivist socialism, but it's also utopian. And doomed to fail, at least on any large scale, whereas other types of socialism may be and usually are more realistic. However, there are other utopian socialisms. Uh, but Marxism I call utopian because of this rather strange notion that a dictatorship is going to somehow blossom into into a classless society. Yeah, okay, right. No, not going to happen. Okay, so, um, however, in saying that in no way is the United States socialist, you've overlooked something important. While it's certainly not national economic policy, it doesn't run all of our economy, it's not the way everything is done. We do have, and the law allows us to have, cooperatives, which are owned and controlled by the employees, and also in some cases by the customers. That can be seen as socialist or tribalist. And both of these economic perspectives, socialism and tribalism, involve cooperatives, and both are on the left, but neither is collectivist in the sense of an all things held in common except for Marxist socialism. And no, I'm not using tribalist in the pejorative sense popularized by some sociologists to refer to some kind of exclusive um, group or a social club or whatever. No, it's not. I don't mean anything like that at all. I'm talking about tribalism as a system in the sense of it has social, political, and economic aspects. And before I get into that, let me have another sip of my soda and try to deal with my throat here. Goodness. So, tribalism in social terms is about extended family or tribe as the basic unit of society, as opposed to this so-called nuclear family, which has become ever more popular in the West since World War II, when automobiles became more widespread, more widely owned, and travel, moving around in search of, goodness, in search of employment became, more commonplace. So you had people leaving the traditional sort of tribal communities in which they and their families had lived for 100 years or more, and going off to cities like Houston or Los Angeles or San Francisco or Boston or New York City or, wherever, in search of gainful employment and a better life. So a tribe as an extended family, as the basic unit of society, instead of this more modern concept of nuclear family or the idea of individualism. And I'll come back to that individualism when I discuss Hoover and his ilk in a little bit. So that's the social aspect of tribalism, is extended family, and by family I don't mean just blood relation. Okay, obviously people marry into a tribe or a family. So that's one way that blood relation is not the only thing that tribe means. Another thing is for 2,000 years or more, tribes have adopted or fostered people into their midst, people who were not blood related, orphans or foreigners, people who were cast up from the sea after a shipwreck or something, and they came and joined the tribe. They learned the tribe's ways, their customs, their culture, their language, and became contributing members of the society. So people moved around, not as much then as now, but they did. People might decide that they don't like the way certain things are being done in this tribe, and they go, together with like-minded people and form their own tribe somewhere else, and maybe take in some other people that they find in that place, and they become part of the tribe as well. So yeah, I'm not talking about blood or genetics or DNA. None of that is a necessary aspect of tribalism. And I'm also not talking about viewing anyone outside the tribe as subhuman or any of that kind of nonsense. None of that is a necessary component of tribalism. Now, as far as the political aspects of tribalism, basically, we're talking about a decentralized polity, such that two or more tribes may join together in a time of crisis, like a war, and they will confederate. And then once the war or whatever other type of crisis it may be ends, they may or may not retain their confederation. They may instead go back and become individual tribes again, but they'll remember, their cooperation with the other people and perhaps look upon them favorably from then on, for purposes of trade, and, maybe be less eager to go to war with them because, hey, they were our friends, they helped us out, and so forth and so on. So, but yeah, essentially, the political aspect of tribalism is decentralization, rather than centralization into a nationalism or imperialism or globalism. Tribes, depending on other aspects of their culture, may not be quite so likely to pursue things like imperialism and conquest. I mean, you had, for example, the Celts of Gaul who went down to Rome and sacked it, some years before Julius Caesar came along and decided, hey, let's go conquer the Gauls. They sacked it. They left. They didn't stick around and impose their religion or their sacred tradition, rather, or their language or their any other aspects of their culture on the people of Rome. They said, okay, give us so much silver every year, or we'll come back and beat your ass again. So there are different attitudes politically in terms of what it means to be tribe. And you may find some tribes that may be more interested in conquering and being somewhat imperialistic and imposing their way on the conquered, but it's not typical. Also, then we move on to the economic aspect of tribalism, which is to put it succinctly, it is cooperation. It is the sense of, okay, to put it in terms more modern, say I have this land here, and Joe over here has a tractor, and Vern down here has a tiller, all right? Well, I don't have a tractor and I don't have a tiller, so I get Joe to come and use his tractor and his turning disc to break up my soil, and I get Vernon to come over here and, use his tiller to, to break it up even more. Then I go out and I take my little plow thing and I divide the tilled and plowed land into rows, right? And I plant my seeds, and I go out and I weed the crops throughout the season of growth, and I, find tomato hookworms and pull them off the plants, and I get some ladybugs and, to eat the mites, and I get some of those little tiny red wasps to eat the, the tomato hookworms, and, I take care of the crops while they're growing. Then comes the harvest, and I go out and I harvest the produce, I harvest the crops. And so then I share a portion of the produce with Joe and Vernon because they came and helped me out. And that's a very basic and very oversimplified explanation of cooperation in the sense that I mean it. But I'm also talking about cooperatives, which I mentioned already, I think, yeah, in terms of these things like your rural electric cooperative company, that it's owned by both the employees and the customers, so that the customers get to go to the annual meeting and vote on board of directors and vote on name changes for the company and vote on assorted other items of business. But it's also representative in that they've elected a board of directors who will do, take care of the day-to-day aspects of the business. And then, at some point in the year, you will get a check as a customer of the cooperative that returns some of the money you've paid for your electricity because you are a part owner of the company and the profit is divided between the employees and the customers. Okay, so that's one example of a cooperative. And then, you've got your local farmers co-op, you got the grocery co-op over here, things like that. So that's the concept of economy in a tribal society. So there was a time, Kevin, when the United States was closer to a social democracy, which is a mixed economy. What we're talking about here is FDR's New Deal and for some time after. However, that has been undone, and it was already being eroded before Reagan became president. The process, however, has only accelerated since then, regardless of whether the people in power had an R or a D next to their names. And at this point, I think it's gone beyond, well, it's no longer a mixed economy, but I don't think it's even capitalism anymore. It's moving into, it's moving further to the right. It's moving more into neoliberal corporatism. And let me take a moment here to talk about this concept of neoliberal corporatism. What we're talking about here is far right wing economics. There are three manifestations of the extreme far right economic perspective, or three perspectives, I guess, if you will. And one of those is neoliberal corporatism. That is globalist. Another one of those is state capitalism in the sense of Stalinism and Maoism. That is also globalist. Another is fascism, which is nationalist. All three of those are far, far extreme, far right economic systems. And they differ from one another in various ways. Stromberg, I think it was, in his book on Europe in the 20th century, refers to fascism's 8 salient characteristics, and I think it was the very first one he listed was intense nationalism. So nationalism is definitely an aspect of fascism. But in fascism, you have a sort of a marriage between corporation and state. They kind of cooperate, and the state is probably a little more powerful. Usually, it's a little more powerful, but the economy is vested in the corporate state, basically. With state capitalism, what you have, and I mean Stalinism or Maoism, you have the state basically replaces the factory owner and the landlord and becomes the new factory owner and the landlord, and owns and controls everything. So in that sense, the state is all powerful and corporation is simply owned and controlled by the state. Now, when you get to neoliberal corporatism, what you have in the early stages of that is the government colludes with corporations and props them up, gives them bailouts, such as we saw, a few years ago, gives them tax breaks, or doesn't tax them at all, or even subsidizes them, as we see with the petroleum industry in the United States. At this point in time, there have been enough advances in solar and wind power that it would be less expensive than electricity made from petroleum and coal if the government were not subsidizing the petroleum and coal industries. So as neoliberal corporatism progresses, or regresses, if you will, it eventually gets to the point where the corporations have usurped the place of the state, where the state is, if it even still exists, merely a handmaiden of the corporations. Or, if you want to go full throttle, you've got the state government has been completely replaced by corporations, such as you saw, for example, if you're familiar with the 2099 line of comics that Marvel did back in the, I guess, the mid-90s. There were no real state government. There were no nations anymore. Everything was corporations. Corporations ran everything. So that would be the ultimate end goal, basically, of neoliberal corporatism, where corporations run everything and are multinational. They and because they're multinational, they don't have a perspective that they need to obey national laws, because hey, we're bigger than you and we can do what we want. All right. But I'm going to come back to neoliberalism in a bit and discuss that in some further detail. So I'm saying I think that at this point, not only do we not have a mixed economy, we don't even have capitalism anymore. We have perhaps what is called late stage capitalism, or early stage neoliberal corporatism. But then we also have this current administration and Congress, and what they're going to do remains to be seen. And some of the signs point toward possibly an objectivist or so-called libertarian perspective. For example, we've seen President Trump appoint people to his cabinet to head up departments which they have a history of criticizing or even calling to be done away with or dismantled or, cut back. And so that might point towards this kind of objectivist idea of reining in so-called big government and getting rid of regulations and, things like that. So I'm going to move on a little bit here. Porcelain and Riley. I'm going to pause a moment here for another sip of soda. All right, so Porcelain and Riley. At some point during your discussion of this topic, you touched upon the concept of whiteness, and there was reference made to the Irish, who at one time were not viewed as white. In fact, insular Celts, and that is a term which includes the Irish, the Scots, the Manx, the Welsh, the Cornish, and the Bretons. Insular Celts are not white. This may come as a shock, but DNA studies which have been done over the past 20 years or so have demonstrated that insular Celts are primarily descended, and of course there has been some migration, right? Indo-Europeans did move into the Isles, but the bulk of the genetic material, makeup or whatever, if you will, of the people who are insular Celts, whose ancestors have been in the Isles for 2,000 or more years, they're primarily descended from Aboriginal Europeans who were in the Isles long before the Indo-Europeans came out of the Central Eurasian steppes. And it is these Indo-Europeans who are known as Caucasians or whites. So if the Aboriginal Europeans who were there before the whites came along, yeah, they're not white. And white, in this sense, white is not about pigmentation. It's about genetics or DNA. Italians are white. Irish aren't. Italians have olive skin, and many, but by no means all, Irish and other insular Celts are exceptionally pale to the point that instead of tanning in the sun, they burn. But they're not white in a genetic sense. Pigmentation, okay, maybe so. But they don't share the same genetic heritage as the whites who came into Europe from the east and who went into Aryanistan and northern India from the west. You will find many Dravidians, or Aboriginal Hindustanis, if you will, who call themselves black because they're not white in the sense of being of the Indo-Aryan ethnicity of the people who are the predominant people of northern India, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, Iraq, etc. There is, of course, nothing inferior about being an insular Celt or a Dravidian or anything else, or even, of course, a white. There's nothing inferior or superior about that. It's just nature, okay? But to be technically accurate, yes, insular Celts are not Caucasian. They're more closely related genetically to Basques and Sami or Lapps than they are to Indo-Europeans. I myself am of insular Celtic and Indo-European as well as Native American ancestry. And I'm certainly not putting myself down by pointing out that I'm not completely white. And I'm not putting myself down by pointing out that I'm part white. You know, there's no sort of attitude of superiority or inferiority inherent in those concepts, as far as I'm concerned. And I think anyone who says otherwise is a dolt, and I'm being extremely polite. So eventually, not long after that, you all got around to the question of whether or not identity politics is harming the left. And my answer to that is yes. Identity politics, especially in the sense I've discussed it heretofore as a divisive, exclusionary thing, is in fact harming the left, because we need to be standing together in solidarity against the oppressive corporate oligarchy, rather than fighting among ourselves over what are ultimately trivial and superficial differences. So yes, identity politics alienates people. It's exclusionary. It's divisive. And some of the reasons it's alienating and exclusionary and divisive are due to the aspects of what it is, how it is expressed in practice, and the attitudes of the people involved, which are authoritarian, self-righteous, and judgmental. Are there actual meaningful concerns that we have as women, as LGBTI persons, as ethnic minorities, as followers of a minority sacred tradition? Yes. Yes, of course. Of course there are. But until all of the marginalized and disenfranchised people stop battling each other over what are actually nothing but scraps from the master's table, those concerns will not be addressed. We get token gestures based on maybe who makes the most noise at any given moment, but they're just token gestures, and you got to watch what one hand is doing while the other hand is bestowing what appears to be largesse upon you. Because for example, with the so-called tax break for the middle class that was done by one of the previous administrations, the middle class actually wound up paying more in the long run, because they got other taxes that were raised on them, and that more than made up for what little bit they got cut in their income tax. So yeah, always watch what both hands are doing, and you can be sure if the government is making a lot of noise about something, that you need to be looking somewhere else too, to see what they're not making noise about, to see what other kind of shenanigans they're up to. So yeah, of course we have concerns, and they are real and actual and meaningful, and they do need to be addressed. But the first struggle, the most important struggle which we must face together in solidarity against the corporate oligarchy, or the 1%, or whatever you want to call robber barons, if you will. And this is what Senator Sanders was focused on before the Democratic National Convention, and with good reason. He kept bringing everything back to the billionaire class, or the 1%. He constantly wanted to point out the economic inequality in our society. And basically, until we have economic freedom, and I do not mean deregulation of corporations and anti-labor policies and other things of that nature. I mean economic freedom for the people themselves, not freedom to, screw over the environment or your employees. This exploitation crap has got to stop. And that goes in many directions. It has to do with the environment. It also has to do with employees. It's just another form of redistribution of the wealth, but in this case, it's basically the reverse Robin Hood, where the wealthy are stealing from the poor. I'm going to move on a little bit further here and talk about so-called left. Limousine liberals is a term that's used to refer to people who espouse Enlightenment values, at least on an intellectual level, but they approach problems or challenges from a top-down perspective and then impose their proposed solutions from the top down without any consultation with the people who will be affected by those so-called solutions, without any consultation with the people who are affected by the challenges, real or perceived. They don't go among the affected to find out what they think needs to be done. And this is one of the most interesting differences between limousine liberals and other liberals and progressives. Progressives go into the communities that are affected. They work with the affected people to come up with grassroots solutions to these challenges. But limousine liberals are not the left, even in American terms, and certainly not in terms used outside the United States. And again, I want to point out, I'm talking about left in economic terms, and liberal is a social and or cultural term. We've got to get beyond this conflation of partisan rhetoric with the actual meanings of terms. So, for example, for decades, the Republicans have pointed their fingers at the Democrats and said, the left, the left, the left. Well, no, the Democrats are not the left, and they haven't been in a very long time. Not since FDR. Truman, JFK, LBJ, and Carter were centrists. They weren't leftists. And Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. Well, I'm going to address neoliberals in a bit, in a moment here. So let me just go on here. Limousine liberals are not the left. Some of them may be part of the left, but by no means are they the entirety of the left. There are also socialists, tribalists, communists who are part of the left. To conflate liberals with the left is not only incorrect in terms of conflating the different axes or dimensions of perspective, but it's also incorrect in terms of excluding the people who also make up the left, or who really are the left, in distinction to the limousine liberals. It is a mistake to generalize from the limousine liberals to the left. It is a mistake to generalize from the Democratic Party to the left. And the Democratic Party, as I said, is not leftist. It hasn't been in a long time, at least in terms of the party establishment. Now, rank and file members of the party, maybe so. I mean, there have certainly been attempts since the 1970s to take the Democratic Party towards the left. And those have failed, and they're going to continue to fail. And I'll get to that in just two shakes of a, of a dog's tail or whatever. But as for neoliberals, the ones who currently dominate the apparatus of the Democratic Party, they are utterly right-wing. Neoliberal, as a name, comes from the economic aspects of classical liberalism taken to an extreme, as epitomized by Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover, which was by any definition far right-wing. What we're talking about here is deregulation of industry, removing all of the environmental regulations, undoing anti-monopoly laws and policies, gutting basically the Sherman Antitrust Act, the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which made it possible for the situation we have now, in which 5 or 6 mega corporations control 90% of the media in this country. Anti-labor policies, promotion of bubble economy, encouragement of risky lending practices, trickle-down economics, all that stuff. That was Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover to a T, and that's what we've seen again ever since Reagan became president. And it doesn't matter if they had a D or an R by their name, they've pursued the same economic policies. I have a quote here from Ralph Nader, and he said, quote, "The only difference between Democrats and Republicans is the velocities with which their knees hit the floor when corporations come knocking," end quote. One of the people in Google Plus communities who saw this after I shared it said the Democrats' knees hit the ground a little more slowly because they look around first to make sure nobody's watching. You've got Noam Chomsky some years ago said, in the U.S. there is basically one party, the business party. It has 2 factions called Democrats and Republicans, which are somewhat different but carry out variations on the same policies. By and large, I am opposed to these policies, as is most of the population, end quote. There was a fellow by the name of Carroll Quigley, who was a professor. He was, in fact, one of Bill Clinton's professors. You can take that for what it's worth. Once you hear this quote I'm going to give you, it might put some things in perspective. Carroll Quigley wrote a book, rather a long book, oh my, well over 1,000 pages. It's called Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time. It was first published in 1966. I have the second printing, 1974. On pages 1247 to 1248 of that, Professor Quigley wrote, quote, the argument that the 2 parties should represent opposed ideals and policies, one perhaps of the right and the other of the left, is a foolish idea acceptable only to the doctrinaire and academic thinkers. Instead, the 2 parties should be almost identical, so the American people can throw the rascals out at any election without leading to any profound or extreme shifts in policy, end quote. I will remark that he seems to use the term doctrinaire and academic thinkers rather a lot in this book. I mean, it's not like every other word, but I did notice doctrinaire seemed to be one of his favorite insults of people. Anyway, so there you have that. Oh, and also, while I'm on the subject of that, let me just I'll give you another quote here. It's a little older than Carol Quigley. It goes back to the Renaissance period or Renaissance period. And I will spare you the Italian and just give you my translation. Quote, for the general mass of men are satisfied with appearances as though they, for the general mass of men are satisfied with appearances as if they exist. Indeed, many times they are most moved by the things which seem to be, rather than by the things that are. End quote. This is from chapter 25 of book 1 of Discourses on the First 10 Books of Titus Livius by Niccolò Machiavelli. Appearance instead of reality. So yeah, you can have two parties, and they may appear to be different because of their rhetoric, but when you watch what they actually do when they are in power, yeah, there are only slight variations. They're basically the same policies. It's all neoliberalism. And an issue here is, what do we do about that? Of course, the two main parties seem to have a stranglehold on everything political in this nation at this point in time. We do, however, need to be aware of numbers. Democrats are bleeding members rapidly. I mean, both of these parties are basically committing suicide, but Democrats seem to be doing it more quickly than Republicans and are very probably in the relatively near future going to no longer be one of the two major parties. Before the general election, they already had less members than the Republican Party. We're talking about approximately 17% of registered voters who were still registered as Democrat just before the general election. And the Republicans had 26% of registered voters. 14% of people were Bernie-crats who had left the Democratic Party or were never part of it. But those who were had left after the convention in Philly or after the primary season was over. There were a few who might still have lingered around up till the convention, maybe a few. In fact, I know of several for the first month or so after the convention who still didn't really know what the hell to do because they were, still hoping that somehow something was going to change or, but it didn't, and eventually they kind of drifted away from the Democratic Party to the point that just before the general election, 14% of Bernie-crats had left the Democratic Party. 14% of all registered voters were Bernie-crats who had left the Democratic Party or who had never been in the Democratic Party. And that left 17% of registered voters registered as Democrats and 26% registered as Republicans, with 43% who either were registered as independent or no party preference or members of some third party or live in a state where there is no party registration. So they may or may not consider themselves members of one or another of the two parties, or they may not, or they may view themselves as affiliated with one of those two parties, or they may not. And it is difficult to come to any complete conclusion based on these numbers because of the fact that there are states which don't have party registration. But if we take the 43% of independents, no party preference, third party, or people who live in states without party registration, add the 14% of ex-Democrats who were Bernie supporters, that makes 57% of all registered voters, which means that there are more of those people than there are of both the Republicans and Democrats put together. Now, it may be the case that some of the Bernie-crats went back into the Democratic Party in the hope that it could be reformed, but this has been tried again and again since the 1970s. And I'll state now why the 1970s, Liviana. Well, the answer is that in the 1972 election, Richard Nixon thoroughly trounced George McGovern. And George McGovern was widely seen as a peace candidate. He was very popular among the progressives, who are not the same thing as the liberals. There have been epic battles between progressives and liberals in the past, and there is another one shaping up now. We saw the beginnings of it in the Bernie versus Hillary showdown. But it's going to become more pronounced. One of the, I guess the most recent one before this present one was during the Vietnam era, when progressives were in favor of not being involved in Vietnam, in favor of the peace movement and so forth. And liberals, well, you know, they had LBJ in office, they had JFK in office, and that, you know, that's what their party was doing, and that's what they were after, and so they supported it. And that was a great struggle, a great battle between progressives and liberals. Well, somehow or another, the progressives managed to get enough support to get George McGovern nominated as president by the Democratic Party. And unfortunately, Mr. McGovern was thoroughly skunked by Richard Nixon, the incumbent. There is some wild cat outside my house yowling. I think it may be in heat. So if you hear that sound, that's not one of my cats. So anyway, what happened in response to this utter defeat was the Democratic Party establishment decided that they were never going to let that happen again, and they thought that the reason it happened was because McGovern was a grassroots candidate, that he was a progressive, that he was a populist. And so they took steps to ensure that grassroots activists and grassroots populists would not be able to seize the party, would never be able to take over the party. So what they did was they rewrote the charter and bylaws of the Democratic Party. And by all means, you know, you can find the charter and bylaws of the Democratic Party today on the internet, and go and look them up, go read them. If somehow you can find a copy of the pre-1972 charter and bylaws, hey, great, please give me a link to it, because I don't know where to find it. But have a look at it and compare it to the way the charter and bylaws are now, and you will see that the way they are now is set up to make sure that the people who are already in power in the party remain in power in the party. So it's been tried again and again since the 1970s with Rainbow Coalition, Progressive Democrats of America, We the People, I think was the name of the group that was in between those two. And now we have Our Revolution, we have Brand New Congress, we have indivisible, we have Justice Democrats, it's not going to work again. They will fail, just as it has failed every other time. The Democratic Party will not allow itself to be reformed. It's not going to be moved to the left. We've got people in the leadership like Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi who have made it very plain that they don't see any reason to reform. They have no intention of allowing the party to be reformed. You've got some of them who think that the reason that they lost this election was because they were too far to the left. And I'm sitting here thinking to myself, what episode of The Twilight Zone is anything that they were advocating remotely leftist? Because it ain't, okay? I mean, we had this claim after the convention that the platform of the Democratic Party for 2016 was the most progressive platform the Democrats have ever had. And I looked at it, and I looked at the 1956 platform of the Republican Party, and I said to myself, and several other people, if that's the most progressive platform the Democrats have ever had, that is really pathetic, because this 1956 platform of the Republican Party is more progressive than the 2016 platform of the Democratic Party. So, what's the way forward then? Well, I mean, we need to educate the average voter as to what these numbers are that I talked about already, the 17 and 26 and 43 and 14%, or 17 and 26 and 57%, so that they know, yes, you can elect a third-party candidate, because there are more of us than there are of them. Or at least there are more of us than there are of either one of them. But it's more than just the numbers. There's also the fact that, it's not a single-faceted issue. One facet is the unfortunate reality that most registered voters are unaware of those numbers. Yes. Another facet is that they don't know the platforms of the various third parties and are therefore unwilling to support any of them. And another facet is disillusionment with the entire voting system. The idea that you can't fight City Hall, and that no matter who I vote for, one of the two-party candidates is going to win. It's inevitable, or whatever, and there's no way to elect a third-party candidate or whatever. So they don't bother to learn what the other parties stand for. And of course, you have the suppression of third-party platforms and campaigns by the mainstream media and the Commission on Presidential Debates. Now, the Commission on Presidential Debates is not a nonpartisan organization like the League of Women Voters, which ran the presidential debates before the CPD. It is instead a bipartisan corporation owned and operated by the two major parties, the Democrats and Republicans, and therefore has a vested interest in keeping those two parties in power and keeping any other options out of the public eye, basically. And to say nothing of the propaganda spewed by the two parties accusing third-party candidates of being kooks, or useful idiots for the Russians, or spoilers, or any number of other things. It doesn't help that some third-party candidates are kooks, but most people never hear of those candidates, with a few notable exceptions, like Vermin Supreme, for example. But I'm getting off topic here. So let me get back to what you all have talked about. um, in your live stream. The neoliberal, as I've pointed out, that name comes from the economic aspects of classical liberalism taken to an extreme, as epitomized by Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, which was by any definition far right-wing. Kevin, leftism is not pro-capitalist, and there's no left in any meaningful use of the term, which is not simply based on partisan rhetoric, which is in favor of capitalism. I mean, the most you might have would be the social democracy type thing, which is a mixed economy. That's not really left; it's center. And you've got some social democrats who are a little more to the right and some who are a little more to the left. And all that really means is how much socialism they want and how much capitalism they want. The ones who are more to the left want more socialism. The ones who are more to the right want more capitalism. Left is socialism, is tribalism, is communism. That's what left is. The right is capitalism, and go all the way to the extreme, you get fascism and corporatism and state capitalism. But we need to get beyond this conflation of partisan rhetoric with the actual meanings of terms. We also need to get beyond the one-dimensional single line continuum and even the two-dimensional models like the political compass and similar schemes. Even three-dimensional, four-dimensional, five-dimensional, all of those are still too limited and limiting. I have already sent you some stuff in your Discord PMs, stuff that I've written and published in the Progressive Flame. I'm going to include links to those here in the description for this video, and I hope that those will explain where I'm coming from here, talking about multiple dimensions of perspective instead of just one or two or three or four or five. There's another piece of the puzzle that I'm still working on. It will expand beyond what I've already written to even more dimensions. But the first three, which are already published, should give you a basic understanding of what I'm talking about. And you are correct that Hillary never focused on anything of substance in her campaign. It was all about feeling, and it was about identity. So, for example, we had this line basically that she's a woman and we need a woman president, and if you don't vote for her, then you must be a sexist and a chauvinist and a misogynist. And it was about the usual bifurcation fallacy and argumentum ad metum, or appeal to fear, which we have seen again and again from the Democratic establishment. And that was basically the claim that there are only two choices. There's your bifurcation fallacy, because there are more than two choices. I've already touched upon third parties. And the claim that if you don't pick me, then you'll get the big bad twomp. Well, there's your argument. Your appeal to fear. And it's ridiculous, and it's childish, and it's condescending, and it is insulting. No issues, nothing meaningful. And when she did dare to venture into discussion of policies, she would invariably come down on the wrong side of things. She didn't even offer any position on the Dakota Access Pipeline, which, was more than enough to say that she wasn't opposed to it. She opposed a living wage, for example. She claimed that universal single-payer health care is somehow impossible, when in fact, we're already paying far more. We're already paying far more, even in public funds, than we would if, say, HR 676 were to be passed and signed into law. Now we have this. Yes, Obamacare is an improvement over what we had before, because at least pre-existing conditions now cannot be excluded from coverage, right? So that's definitely an improvement. But it's not much of an improvement. Obamacare, as it's called, the Affordable Care Act, was written by insurance companies. And it really should be called Romney Care, because it was the same thing Mitt Romney had. It was his idea. And that's basically what we got, and it's being miscalled Obamacare. And I'm not defending Obama here. Obama was not and is not a progressive or a leftist. I remember early in his first term how a lot of Republicans kept trying to claim that he was a socialist, and I wondered in what episode of The Twilight Zone does a socialist bail out extremely wealthy corporations and banks. It's completely illogical to call him a socialist. He's not. That's just a fact. But this new thing the Republicans have voted on in the House of Representatives and passed in the House of Representatives recently, that was also written by the insurance companies. And the thing that the Democrats are kind of floating now, the public option, well, let me just say the Republican thing that they've recently passed in the House of Representatives, it would not be an improvement. It would be a step backwards, because it would be a more promotion of private insurance companies. And they are leeches. They want to make a profit. That's what they're about. They're about making a profit for their stockholders. And they do that by refusing coverage and by charging high premiums and requiring high copays and so forth. So their interest is not in the health of their customers. Their interest is in the profit of the corporation itself for the executives in the corporation and their stockholders. So yeah, no, the Affordable Care Act was an improvement, yes, but not by much. It was still a massive gift to private insurance companies. The Republican plan now would be going backwards, even though it still requires pre-existing conditions to be covered. It would be moving back toward privatization. We've also got this thing that the Democrats are trying to float now, which is the public option. But the public option has failed every time it's been tried before on state levels because, well, for a number of reasons, but I think one of the one of the main reasons is because when you have the public option, you also still have private insurance, and therefore the only people who go for the public option are people who have serious health issues or who cannot afford private insurance. And so eventually the system collapses under its own weight, and that would happen on the national level too. So it's not really an improvement. It would not be a step forward. It would ultimately fail, and then opponents could point at it and say, see, we need to go back to privatization. No, we don't actually. What we need is H.R. 676, which is a National Improved and Expanded Medicare for All Act. It is a bill in the House currently, and it's currently in committee. Hasn't been voted on, hasn't been brought to the floor. But that would save money, considerable amount of money. It would involve far less paperwork and therefore less headache for healthcare providers. And look, the healthcare professionals would still be paid, of course. But this bill proposes that all of the National Improved and Expanded Medicare for All would be covered by taxes paid up front. And I have some other stuff on my in my writings on the Progressive Flame that discuss this as well. And I'm not going to get into your other topics tonight or this morning where I assume went on to discuss Trump Care because it was in the title of the video. So I don't want to go too far into this right now, but I will say that HR 676 is what we need. It would be an improvement both on Obamacare and on the Republican health care, and is far more likely to succeed than the public option. Okay, so I think that does it. That's about an hour. It's about 58 minutes into your video. That was your first topic. And so I think that's my my feedback on that identity politics thing. And I got off topic and chased a few rabbits here and there. And so I'm going to go ahead and close this at this point, I believe. And yeah, this is already, wow. I didn't think I'd gone quite that long, but it looks like an hour and a half already. So I'm gonna stop the video at this point, or stop the recording at this point, and say I will get back to your live stream, the rest of your live stream later, and I may have additional feedback to offer at that point in time. I hope that by then I'm over the allergies and haven't sat up all night smoking cigarettes to the point that I can't really talk anymore. But anyway, so I hope this has provided some food for thought and so forth. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, good whatever to wherever you are, whoever might accidentally have happened upon this video. And so I'll probably do some more videos in the future, but that's all for now.